Well, it's JP Morgan Thursday here in the Bay Area. And, well, the week kicked off with a slew of deals headlined by a nearly $15 billion takeout of Intracellular by Johnson & Johnson. That was quickly followed by a few other deals. The sun shone. Union Square was a buzz of people sitting side by side around the ice rink, and a lot of conversations were happening. There was a good buzz. So joining me to discuss all of this, Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne, my fellow executive editor, Selena Koch, and our head of BD here at BioCentury, Josh Berlin. And I am Jeff Cranmer. I want to go right to Simone. I barely saw her in 4 days. Simone, what'd you get up to?
Well, thanks, Jeff, and welcome everybody to this special JP Morgan podcast. And I say that because I want to shout out to a few of our podcast enthusiasts that I met during the week. You know who you are. Really, it was a pleasure to meet you. So I hope you're listening to this one as well. Jeff, we talked about Jeffries, right? The weather really imitated people's mood. Well, here I think it was the opposite. We had amazing weather, and I personally think that lifted everybody's mood. It's just, for all that haters out there, it's actually a spectacular city, is San Francisco, and just really lovely to be in this weather.
Preach, this is my town.
Yeah, it's mine too. So, I just want to talk about 2 or 3 high-level things that I think we'll get into with Selena and Josh. So, first of all, I think you're right. There was a buzz, and there was this sort of general good feeling, optimism. As I said, maybe partly the weather, maybe partly the kickoff of those deals. The one consensus that I'm hearing, most people think this is going to be a good year for deals and M&A. Mixed with that optimism, I will say, not many people think they're particularly optimistic about the capital markets opening up, right? And there's another big overhang, which is if they don't, then small VC funds will be under threat to survive. This is a difficult time for those smaller VCs. That's something that several of them are quite nervous about, actually. A few of us heard that we'll get into, which is that it was a kind of a thinner JP Morgan, fewer people. I don't think that's all because they were outside in Union Square. I think there really were fewer people. I have a few hypotheses. One, of course, is that everyone stayed home to watch the Australian Open, this being a later year than others. If it wasn't that, maybe you guys can tell me what you think. I sort of feel like maybe this is because there are fewer companies. Maybe the culling that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is parlaying through to JP Morgan. Maybe smaller companies without that much money aren't sure that spending a ton of money on San Francisco during JP Morgan is the best way to use their resources. Those are a couple of thoughts. And, maybe there's just general less FOMO about you have to be at JP Morgan to get things done. It sort of felt like not the old days, but the old days, right? Where you could go to JP Morgan and you can actually find a place in a coffee shop to sit. So, it was fun. It was good. There were plenty of people, but it wasn't no breathing room, elbow to elbow. One other thing I'll say is that among the people that I spoke to, they really felt that there were fewer meetings, but better meetings. And that might go back to the sort of that maybe this is more focused rather than just I have to be there. Those are a couple of my thoughts. What do you think, guys?
Josh, what do you think? I ran into quite a few events. One event that we went to last night, which was actually quite full and probably triple the size that it used to be, was the Korea Biotech event. I feel like when we went in 2020, it was quite small. It was very Korean. And last night it was a lot of Westerners there. And I don't know, Josh, what did that say to you?
Yeah, I actually agree with both of you because I was at a few events that were not Asia focused, and they did seem a little less crowded than, certainly the last couple of years. I also agree that folks seemed in a much better mood than the last couple of years as well. Agree that San Francisco is gorgeous and nice weather like we had. So that certainly helped. But, I arrived Saturday around noon. So this was before some of the deals were even announced. And the first event I went to was the Bay Helix annual meeting, which is a meeting of cross-border China and Asia life sciences executives. And it was quite crowded, more crowded than I remembered in recent years. And your point about Western folks attending, a lot of Western folks in the audience. Agree with you. The Korean night also, a lot of Western folks in the audience. BioCentury hosts what we call an IR pitching session on Tuesday with Korea Bio and Sidley. So it's sort of a Korea-focused event. Jeff, you moderated a great panel with several investors, but that also was standing room only. I wonder if, some of the cross-border deals that we've been seeing, this Asia newco model, which has really sort of captured, I think, the imagination not only of China and Asia biotech CEOs, but also Western investors. And so I wonder if, to a certain extent, there were a lot of folks using JP Morgan to learn more about cross-border opportunities, build relationships, given that there is always a large Asia presence here in San Francisco this week. Depending on which event you went to on the sidelines, I did think some were more crowded than last year, but others, like Simone mentioned, less. And I was able to pop into a few coffee shops and actually find a place to chat one-to-one with someone, which is, as everyone knows, kind of rare usually at JP Morgan.
On the newco model front, I think my favorite line that I heard meeting with the CFO of a Chinese company, and he said, "Everyone here wants a piece of Ken Song." Ken Song, of course, sold his Raise Bio to Bristol Myers about a year ago for about $4 billion, and then last year turned around and launched one of these newcos, bringing together assets from a couple of different companies, raising a couple $100 million. And people, I think, are really seeing him as kind of the model of how to get this done. He was also on one of the panels at the Global IR event. Selena, I know you go into this meeting very specific every year. You're specifically looking to catch up with generally small neurology companies. I wonder what you were looking for this year, and what did you hear?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. You started this conversation off mentioning Intracellular, that big acquisition. So I think last year at this time, there had been the Cerevel and Karuna deals, and there was just a lot of optimism that psychiatry drug development was back, and there was this appetite for assets. And then 2024 didn't really deliver on that. And now we have another big one. So there is optimism around it. But I think mostly what I'm hearing is that, yeah, the expectation is for M&A this year, and that largely is driven by this idea the FTC is going to, kind of loosen its stance. But there have to be assets. And a lot of companies, bigger companies, they want growth drivers. They want de-risk late-stage things. And there just aren't a ton of those available in the neurology space. So 2025 in that area may be looking more like partnerships and licenses.
Yeah, I think, it's going to be a question, and we've sort of written about this in some of our analyses, where there is a limit of the late stage assets. Everybody knows that. And so the question for farmers is, as you point out, M&A versus a partnership deal, and what kind of risk taking or risk sharing kind of arrangement are they going to come up with for the earlier assets? And so, we've seen the concurrent spin-out structures, which we did, of course, this week also with the Scorpion takeout by Lilly. And in the meetings, and I also did a couple of panels, there was very much a feeling that and other similar kind of structures, that one was also quite backloaded with milestones, will be the flavor. And so you're right, there's a lack of assets, and they've got to do some creative deals to get around that. There's obviously a difference between partnering and M&A. There seems to be still a fair amount of enthusiasm that can happen. So I feel like maybe the good meetings that people were having were around partnering, maybe more than expectations of financings. I don't know, because we're obviously not in those meetings, but that's sort of what we're hearing.
Yeah, on a sort of separate related note, I heard a couple of people say something along the lines of, well, M&A deals are the new licenses, or vice versa. With so many M&A deals in these new formats where there are a lot of milestones heavily backloaded, the difference between licensing and M&A is becoming smaller.
Right. And it may well be for the farmers that, let's be honest, an acquisition, it has its hurdles in terms of integration, but also you own the whole process. And, I haven't actually asked them from a logistical point of view what's easier, and we can think about that. But you're right, it's sort of a balance of risk sharing versus operational efficiency.
Yeah, and I think if you're a VC in one of these companies, all things being equal, assuming it's not a fire sale, in most cases prefer M&A, right? Because it gives you a sort of instant exit versus an IPO, for instance. So,
Well, versus an IPO that you think isn't going to happen.
correct, that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, on the deal flow side, I mean, the other thing I would say is I thought there were a lot of big pharma folks in these Asia events that I hadn't seen before. So I focus a lot of my time on going to these Asia events during JP Morgan because it's a opportunity to catch up with folks without getting on a 15-hour flight. And I just noticed a lot of, I won't name any of them, but a lot of big pharma folks in these events, networking, sometimes on stage, talking about what they're looking for. And so in terms of assets, I think, it's certainly a recognition. Obviously, China's getting a lot of the news flow, but I was seeing it in Korea events. There was a great Singapore event that Enterprise Singapore put on yesterday on Wednesday. A lot of big pharma folks in that room. So I think there is this recognition that assets are available potentially in Asia, and that it's an opportunity for pharma to, in some cases, catch up to some of their peers if they're missing an ADC or they're missing an obesity compound. It's really become a huge opportunity for folks to catch up, I think.
Absolutely. I actually had a few people voice some fears to me, quietly about whether in, I don't know what the time frame would be, 10 years from now, we'll do any discovery in the US because everything's going so fast in China and everybody wants assets from there now. And you can, get into these early clinical trials quickly and get your initial human data, that maybe the US is like seeding that ground.
And even the early stage work, I talked to one Asian company with a BTK, and they're like, "Yeah, we're behind now, but we have every confidence we're going to catch up to this U.S. company within a year, even though the U.S. company had a couple of years head start."
I just want to point out that, first of all, you might be right, Selena. Maybe the US is giving ground. Overhanging all of this, it was lovely to escape the very beautiful snow from my new hometown, Washington, D.C., and find that most people in this beautiful San Francisco didn't spend the same amount of time thinking about the federal government that people in DC do. But at the same time, there was this big shadow, and two particular ones. One related to whatever the next version of the BioSecure Act will be. I got a lot of questions. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the China interface, let's call it, and what kind of restrictions might come in and what they might look like and what the probability of that is. So there's a sort of overhang there of cautiousness where people don't know what's going to happen. And obviously the other one is FDA. And the concern there, we've talked about it endlessly. We're going to, my colleague Steve Austin will write a lot more about it. RFK Jr., how much will he or won't he influence what actually happens? Fair amount of support for Marty Makary heading the FDA, but still there is this idea, a couple of big fears. One is that FDA, what goes on in terms of regulation and so on in terms of the politics of that.
But a drain, right?
Yeah, but even
Sony already is resigning.
The people leaving FDA, and is that in particular, is that all going to slow down drug development? And their concern is not only will it slow down drug development for themselves, but do the capital markets, do the generalists look at it and just think that is way too risky for me and keep the markets closed? And I don't really remember an era like this, but that's mostly because I've been covering this field from this perspective in the good years, last good years. But I do think that kind of FDA risk is something that a lot of new people in the industry are digesting.
Mm-hmm. So turning back to financing, I heard some different opinions on the mega rounds. Of course, mega rounds last year, according to John Norris of HSBC, about 106 of these mega rounds for biotechs. And in talking to John, he was sort of wondering how long this mega round phenomenon will last. Like, obviously, companies, there's this fear of the Series B investor, he said. And so a lot of investors, of course, banding together to give a company enough money to get to a very significant milestone. But John wondered, if there's so many investors, they're all getting smaller stakes, what are the implications for ROI? And then I heard another person on a panel at the Biotech Showcase, always a great event, now at the Hilton, or it has been for the past couple of years. And this investor who manages or works at a fund worth over $100 billion, she was saying that mega rounds are here to stay. It's the way of the future. So I'm wondering, Josh, Simone, if you heard any chatter about what venture looks like.
The chatter that I heard, as I mentioned, is the mega rounds are still creating these large valuations and then difficult to get a multiple out of that.
Yep.
If you don't have an IPO market, you've got to be leading towards what we've just been talking about, which is M&A deals, is the exits. And what I'm hearing actually in the Bay Area, we have a few friends who are not in biotech, so I'm hearing this even outside of biotech, is that a lot of smaller investors just can't get in the game or can't afford to be in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know whether if that trend is true, whether you're leading to then just a different class of VCs or a different, you're squeezing out the smaller ones in the way that I talked about at the beginning.
Yeah,
that's where it's going to lead.
That's one of the things that I was hearing. Like, if you're a VC with your 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th fund, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
But VCs on their 2nd or 3rd, they might be struggling to raise.
Or new ones, right?
Yeah.
Haves and the have-nots kind of structure.
Just returning to a minute for what Simone was talking about uncertainty with what's happening with the FDA. There is a lot of risk there, but it comes on a backdrop of what had been an improving picture. I mean, again, I follow neurology very closely, and we have seen a willingness of FDA to look past primary endpoints, to embrace surrogate endpoints, which wasn't a thing in neurology not very long ago. Obviously, that was with the amyloid therapies and then with tofersen and ALS, but not just there. I mean, more recently, we've seen conversations in the Huntington disease space about various surrogate or intermediate clinical endpoints. And there's just this buzz in the community, like, we're going to be able to make this happen and get things through in a reasonable amount of time. And it's going to just be a huge factor in cracking open the space. So there's a lot at risk there. And, if the picture stays the same, neurology could kind of be fueled and take off.
I just want to add to that, because putting forward to your 5-year, or I don't think it's 10 years, but that vision. So I had a lot of biomarker conversations this week, and also a lot of AI-ish conversations, as I'm sure everybody did. And so certainly in neuro, and we'll be writing about all of these things, of course, in BioCentury, the types of biomarkers, including digital biomarkers, and even just think about them as technologies. They may not all be surrogate endpoints, but the ways that people are gathering information that is reading out and predicting earlier those kinds of diseases, I think, changing quite fast. I've been saying for 25 years that neuro is just about to take off, but really neuro is just about to take off or has already taken off. And I think that, these things will come together, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see FDA, and this isn't really a leadership question or a political question, but it's going to see how they tackle, as you point out, some of the new kinds of endpoints, the need for new endpoints and new measures in moving forward with some of these diseases, which have really, frankly, got quite archaic ways that we define them even. So there's certainly, on the innovation front, a lot going on. And maybe that is also what's fueling much of the optimism, just to bring it home to that, Jeff, because there are no conversations that I'm having that suggest, you talked about not enough assets, but none of them are suggesting not enough innovation, right? They might not be far enough ahead, but there's lots of new technologies and, new things going on in disease. And it's a long way away from, like, can we make a 3 times a day down to a once a day kind of question?
Yeah, and I think I in particular, right, with the whole immune reset paradigm.
Right.
with CAR Ts, but now moving beyond that into other modalities that people are hoping might be able to do the same thing. There's a lot of innovation coming this year.
Well, hey, that's a great place to end it. Definitely happy for the sun. Happy to see a good buzz in San Francisco around JP Morgan. I felt like I heard fewer naysayers. Maybe they were just all happy off skiing and they had good powder, so they weren't really feeling the FOMO, and they just left us to our wine and mocktails up in the city. If you're out in San Francisco, safe travels home. We've got a 3-day weekend coming up here in the US, so we will be back next Tuesday rather than Monday as we give a little respect to MLK for MLK Day here in the US.
Yeah, Jeff, maybe if I could just also, for those who are interested in this Asia newco model and some of this cross-border deals we're seeing between Asia and the West, I know you and Simone and I will be out in Singapore for our 4th East-West Summit, March 3 to 5 in Singapore again. You can learn more at BioCenturyEastWest.com. But if you want to continue those discussions, we'd love to see you in Singapore in March. So please come
that's
out.
A great call, Josh. I am probably halfway through picking the presenting companies who will be at the meeting. So if you're interested in being a presenting company or attending the meeting,
you just have to butter up Jeff, is what we're hearing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We can't promise you Taylor Swift this year as we did last year, but I
want to make one more point. One great way to butter up Jeff and the rest of us, if you are a podcast fan, and I know because so many of you I spoke to this week, go ahead, put something in our show notes, Jeff. Tell people how they can show the love.
Oh, well, you can always smash down on the like button and hit subscribe. Leave us a review, and you can also submit a question, which we'd always love to get, and we'll answer it here on the next pod. So, all right, well, as I said, safe travels home, and we will catch you next Tuesday. And a special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for BioCentury this week.